Greetings. Some time ago, Julifer had mentioned in one of her videos that she actually wanted people to step back from the cliche of saying that Goth is embracing the darker things in life and get a little more specific on their thoughts of what it really is to be Goth. And I guess this is my attempt to do so. When it comes right down to it, to me, Goth is, and I believe perhaps unknowingly to many people, Goth is an ambiance. It's not just a fashion. It's not just the music. But it's a feeling of the darker, the more mysterious, those things associated with death and creepiness. It's embracing the magical and unexplained in a world that, for most intents and purposes, science has and can explain. And that's not saying anything bad about science in any way, shape, or form. I personally quite love science, and I'm quite a technophile. But when you consider Goth as an ambiance, it is far more inclusive than any of the other definitions I've ever seen. And it also, within that inclusivity, still will maintain kind of a standard that can be used to actually determine, for the most part, whether or not something is Goth. People will always have disagreements about that. That's something I've learned to accept. But if it is that feeling, then it can be inclusive of people who may be of a very Gothic mentality, or artists that create very Gothic work, but who they themselves are not immersed in the subculture. They don't listen to Joy Division or any of the required Gothic listening. It can include people like that. It can, at the same time, exclude a lot of elements that most Goths, not all, but most, generally don't consider to be Goth. Like, for instance, the music of the band Marilyn Manson. The band is a shock rock band. That's pretty much all it's ever been. And as much as even I love Marilyn Manson, until the Angels of Liberty, Marilyn Manson was the only band t-shirt I owned. And I like their music a lot. But it doesn't create the ambiance of what is Gothic. If you consider Goth as an ambiance, you can include things like Nox Arcana, even Jill Tracy, right along with The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. And you can even differentiate whether or not particular songs from an artist or a group are Gothic. For instance, I cannot see Friday I'm in Love as a Gothic song. It just doesn't make any sense to me being considered Goth. And if you're calling The Cure a Goth band, that should suggest that all of their music is. That's why I've, for all intents and purposes, always declared that there are no Goth bands, only Goth music. Now, I'm sure there are a few bands out there that have nothing but Goth music. I know that is actually one of the aims of Angels of Liberty. I applaud them for that. But I would imagine that there's eventually going to be at least one or two songs that they have that aren't, don't have goth as a complete basis. It's going to speak about something else. So I think that's kind of almost an inevitability that you're going to have a mixture of goth things and things that really can't be considered goth from every band. If you consider it an ambiance, then you can make a better judgment call on whether or not attire is goth, because you can plainly feel whether or not something that someone is wearing evokes that kind of ambiance, evokes that sense of mystery, evokes those arcane or death-oriented images. If we say anything can be goth, then goth is meaningless. It means so many things that there's no way that anyone can even talk about it. You can't even distinguish a difference between goth and something else. So it becomes pointless. So you have to be able to make a distinction between things that are goth and not. And doing so doesn't make you an elitist. It doesn't. All it means is that you are making a judgment call on something. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not like your judgment is going to make the difference of whether or not someone gets imprisoned for life or anything of the kind. When I became goth in the 90s, I did so in part because I knew that I was apart from the mainstream. I knew that those things that the mainstream cared about, I didn't. And the things that I did care about tended to be of a much more macabre nature. And I enjoyed researching things that I found to be mysterious and arcane. And I wanted to be able to present myself to the world in such a manner that I appeared a little dangerous. Not to the point where people were worried I was going to pull a gun and shoot everybody in the mall. But I wanted them to think twice before ridiculing me. People recognized that I was different from the mainstream, and I loved it. I thrived on it. But if you keep taking all of these outside elements and declaring them goth and watering down the culture, the use of the culture as a way of self-identifying dissipates completely. And in that, utility loses all meaning. That's why I'm perfectly willing to say that I do not believe that pastel goth has a place in the world. I don't think pastels should use the word goth tacked onto the end of their style. And the same with hipsters, and new, and bubble, and Lolita. None of those things evoke that ambiance of goth. Now, when you look at goth as an ambiance rather than as a fashion or a music, it can be applied to so many more things as well. It can be applied to music. It can be applied to fashion. It can be applied to architecture. It can be applied to movies and books and art and makeup. And really, when it comes down to it, goth has become so much more than just a fashion, than just a music genre. That may have been where it started, but for all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter anymore where it started. What matters is what it's become. So, I'm hoping that people will take that into consideration. And I'm hoping that they'll be willing to make a bit of a stand on what they think Goth is. And be willing to be different. To cast aside the acceptance of the mainstream. Because if you're just accepted as part of the mainstream, then you are the mainstream. And any attempts at deviation from that are meaningless. So that might be a little bit harsh. I don't really mean it to be. I hope it is instead more instructional and gives people food for thought. Thank you.